Hello guys and welcome on Blue Hammock. Today we're gonna review a pandas DataFrame method for importing data into a pandas DataFrame, which is the read_csv method. The read_csv method allows us to import data from external data sources, in this case a CSV file. As you can see from the documentation, it has many parameters, but the mandatory one is only the file path. All the other parameters allows us to customize the import procedure in a very granular way. They may seem intimidating at the beginning, but we don't need to use all of them. So we are gonna make some examples to get some practice with this method. So I will use an example dataset and we will see how it works. For our example, we are going to use this mpg dataset, which is about the fuel consumptions of cars. As we can see, it has many columns, 11, and not so many rows. In total, it is about 200 rows. It has very different data types. So for the cars, we have the manufacturer, the model, the engine displacement, the year of production, the number of cylinders, the transmission type, the type of the drivetrain, the actual consumption in city, the actual consumption on highway, the fuel type, and the class of the car. So we can start with analyzing the data. So first of all, let's import pandas. Then we read the CSV. In my case, it is in a folder called data. So now that we have read the CSV, let's look at the first rows. Okay, we see that there is a column actually in the CSV that it becomes unnamed because it has no label, and we actually see that this was an index call in the CSV. So what we can do, we can use the index call parameter. We pass 0 because it is the first column of the CSV. So now we see that we have no more that unnamed column, and so pandas used that column as an index call. So now let's look at the dtypes that have been inferred for these variables. Okay, we see that manufacturer is an object, model is an object, displacement float, year is an integer, number of cylinder is an integer, transmission type is an object, drivetrain is an object, city consumption is an integer, highway consumption is an integer, fuel type is an object, and class is an object. So all the strings are recognized as objects. Let's say that our CSV had a semicolon as a separator. The default value is no more good to parse the CSV into a data frame, and so we need to specify the sep parameter. In fact, if we don't pass and we leave the default parameter, we see that the result is not what we want, because pandas is not able to separate the columns of the CSV. So we pass the sep parameter, and now we see that the result is what we want. To make another example, let's say that in our CSV we have some strings that can be interpreted as none. For example, we have in the documentation a list of strings that pandas automatically recognized as none. In fact, we see that there is this parameter na_values that says by default the following values are interpreted as none, and it is this list. Sometimes it happens that we want to keep the original string because maybe it was not intended as none. To do this, it is actually simple because we only need to disable the NA filter. So we see that passing NA filter equals false, we keep the original string. If we remove this one, and by default it's true. We see that some of them, the ones that correspond to the recognized none, are converted to none values. Another common situation is the one in which we don't have the dot as a standard decimal separator, but we have the comma, like in this case. The default argument is the dot, but we can change it, because we see if we read the CSV without specifying the separator, it uses the dot and it doesn't recognize that the displacement column is actually a float. Now I passed the decimal argument to the method and we see that displacement is now a float. If we want to read only a portion of the CSV file, we can specify the nrows parameter. So let's say that we want to read only the first 10 lines of the CSV. We see that now the data frame has only 10 rows. We can use the iterator argument to say to pandas to return an iterator object instead of returning a complete data frame. So we specify iterator equals true and the chunk size. So we see that the object that is returned is actually a text file reader. Now to get our data, we can use the get chunk. And we see that it returns a chunk of the first 10 rows. If we call again the method, it will return the next 10 rows and so on until iterator is exhausted. So I hope you enjoyed this video on pandas read CSV method. I hope it was clear how it works and how we can read CSV files into pandas data frame. I hope you enjoyed the content and to see you here next time. Thank you.